Hello, hello, wherever you are. Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Judith Okonkwo, and I'm so pleased to be here today with my colleague, Totes.
Hi everybody. I'm Tokes Bakare. Already had a wonderful introduction. I'm also an autism expert and have been working with children with neurodiversities for several years, both in England and across Europe and in West Africa.
Okay, so we're so excited to dive right into our session today. And as Raul has mentioned, we're going to be talking about Autism VR. Now, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about who we are as Immersive 3D to give you context to what we do. I often kind of like start with the phrase that we want to change the narrative and become creators and not just consumers of technology. And if you are in any way interested in the technology ecosystem on the African continent, you've probably heard this said quite a few times. And I think it's really significant. It definitely shapes the way that we feel about immersive technologies and how important it is that there must be access for people on the continent to these technologies. We, of course, in that vein, are then really committed to trying to grow an XR ecosystem on the continent in any way that we can, and specifically supporting people who might want to consider how they can engage with these technologies and areas in which these technologies could have significant impact. And I think that kind of like brings us really nicely to Autism VR, which is an exploration of that. So Autism VR is a virtual reality game that, I co-created with my colleague Toke that you'll hear about. And, I've just been talking about how important it is for us to really make sure that people are able to create with augmented virtual and mixed reality on the continent, and how important it is that also people start to explore the ways in which we can leverage these technologies. Because I think we've got quite a few gaps, several of which we probably don't have traditional resources to solve. But I think if we start to think creatively, then we might just start to, see ways in which we can plug them. And I think this is a really great example with mental health care. And Tokes will tell you just a little bit more about how we've approached this.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to give you a little bit of context, so working in Nigeria as a behavior analyst, educating children with all kinds of neurodevelopmental disorders, and particularly autism, I found that there weren't very many others doing what I was doing, and I was doing a lot of training within the field. And so I really kind of felt that there's a need for people to just have some basic information about how you can interact with children in a positive way that'll both help them and help you as either a parent, a sibling, an educator, a teacher, a doctor, or whoever, someone in the shop, have better interactions. So that was some of the context as well.
Okay, so this is a still from the very first version of Autism VR. And one thing we probably haven't said is that this is a project that's been going on for quite a few years. So Tokes has talked a little bit about how, first of all, there's this gap in terms of mental health care resourcing in a place like Nigeria. And very early on, we started to talk and collaborate and look for ways in which we could include immersive technology to start to bridge those gaps. So back then, and this was 2018, I believe, we then started to conceive of this game and draw people in from our community, because we try to support a community of creators to build a first iteration. So that young man that you see in the screen is a little boy called Tunde, and you're about to hear just a bit more about him. Okay, so what is Autism VR? We conceived it as a virtual reality game that is voice-driven. So we're using natural language processing for voice interaction. And the idea is that you play a game where you go to a home. Your first encounter in the home is with a character that is known as the guide. And the guide will provide you with some information about how best you can interact with children who might be on the autistic spectrum. And these are just really basic steps that anybody can take. So things like use simple words, not complex sentences, keep a slow modular tone to really engage the child. Now, the aim of the game is that you have this information encounter with the guide, and then you then go on to the next room to visit family friends. And we've called the family friends the Okafas, a typical name in Nigeria that you would expect. And they have a son Tunde, and then the goal is that you are able to, based on the learnings from the guide, interact with this young boy and get him to engage with you and greet you. We've called this level of the game greeting because, of course, that is the goal of it. And we are planning for a second level next year called Play, which will actually involve physical interaction with the child. And here the goal is that we want to build this level for the Google Cardboard system to have it as accessible as possible for our target demographic.
Yeah, so just to dive a little bit deeper into what happens within the game. So particularly in level 1 that we've been building, in that greeting, we ideally incorporated some very, very simple words. So we're programming for just words like come, stand up, that nice job. So very, very simple words just to help the player kind of really interact in a way that'll be helpful for the child who is nonverbal. And then the other thing that happens is, so as you're using those trigger words, you see the character represented by the child who is Tunde. In this case, you'll see Tunde start to respond to those verbal cues, which is amazing to actually experience. And then what also happens is, if you are doing what is actually very intuitive and very natural, when you don't get any response, to do things like increase your volume, do things like start repeating yourself, do things like add more words. So please come over here, come over here. When you do things like that, that in a real life situation can actually confuse a child with autism, for example, or particularly a child who's nonverbal and who doesn't have that receptive language functions, that can be very, very difficult. So in the game, that leads to avoidance behavior. And eventually, if you continue down that road, it'll lead to tantrum behavior. And what we just want to do, the idea is to give you a place where you can practice these things. So that's the aim of the game, is you can actually practice what it's like to overdo it and get into tantrum, and then feel that tantrum, and then be desensitized, if you like, and not have kind of the emotional anxiety that comes with upsetting, the potentially upsetting a real child, because you've been through it and now you can calm yourself down and help calm the child down as well. So those were some of the details that we've gone through so far. Yeah, go ahead, Judah. Okay,
yeah. So you might be wondering why we decided to tackle autism in Nigeria. What brought us to this? As Tokes has mentioned, when she was kind of like describing the work that she was doing, I think she kind of like underscored the fact that there is a significant gap. Mental health care is really under-resourced in a place like Nigeria. And I think what obtains in Nigeria, you can see in much of the African continent. The other element of this is that there is also a significant stigma associated with this disorder and with mental health care, neurodiversity, like all of those spaces across the continent. And Tokes, maybe you want to speak a little bit more to this.
Yeah, absolutely. So I did a lot of research kind of going around the continent and looking at what the infrastructure is like for supporting children, particularly on the spectrum in education. And what I found when I went around was that there's a lot of love that we have. There's a community kind of approach to embracing everybody. And there isn't a lack of wanting children to progress, but there was also a lack of having like structured, qualified strategies for care. So whether it's education, whether it's healthcare, whether it's social care. So that means that essentially in schools, for example, there aren't really enough systems in place that cater to children with different abilities, or children with disabilities, or children particularly with autism. There wasn't a lot of that across the continent. So that was the huge gap that I was seeing. And I really felt like I couldn't replicate myself enough. There are just some simple things we can do here. And if we can get into the hands of everybody, just some techniques that you could do when you come across a child, A, you won't be afraid. Your anxiety won't be elevated. And B, we will help to create some kind of level of understanding for a child who is not responding to you the way you're expecting.
And the other thing, of course, that drove us to consider virtual reality and voice-driven gaming for this was that, we know that there's a resistance to, encountering these issues, engaging with them, but we also know that gamification can really kind of like draw people in and engage them. So we wanted that element. We're also very excited about the potential of knowledge, transfer and knowledge sharing that can happen in a game in this more intuitive way. And we've seen, so far with particularly virtual reality, that there's a very high acceptance and enjoyment rate with our target community. So easily well over 95% of people are very positively engaged with the technology and are excited about it. And we thought that this was something that we could also leverage to advance our course.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So
I mentioned this was a community project. So just kind of like, this is a snapshot of some of the people who have worked on the project over time. Obviously you can see Tokes and I there, and then collaborators from across the world. So just a little bit more about kind of like the thinking. We've talked about the fact that the initial version was created for the Oculus Rift. This consumer version, now we are targeting Google Cardboard, and we're intending to make it an open source project so we can have contributions from the community. We hope to have this distributed on the Google Play Store, and are really driving this approach because, as you know, Africa is considered a mobile first continent. So we know that this is the way that we can get into as many homes as possible and really start to drive this awareness campaign around neurodiversity. I think I might have mentioned a little bit about future developments, where we're thinking about the second level of the game, which is a level that will be called play and will actually involve physical interaction for the child. And for this, we are targeting building for the Oculus Quest 2.
So we are adopting UNICEF's policy guidelines on AI for children as we are focusing on this new build and this new iteration. There are 9 requirements in the guidelines, and our work focuses around 3. Which you see here. So supporting children's development and well-being. And what that really kind of points to is, for the child with autism, we are trying to create an environment in which the child is accepted, the child is understood, and the child is able to develop to their full potential. And through interacting, through the general public being able to interact with this game and play this game and start to acquire these skills and acquire understanding. And we are hoping that the game will help to really create that environment that supports the child. The second and the third, there are ensuring inclusion of and for children, and which means that, which means including children, particularly on the spectrum, parents of children on the spectrum, and advocates of children on the spectrum in our design process. And in the previous slide where you saw all of the team, that has included that. So we've also had feedback and sessions with parents of children on the spectrum, for example, and just talk to them about, what their goals are and what their reality is. Certainly for me in my career over the years, of about 15 years, having worked very, very closely with parents, you know, I've heard a lot of stories and a lot of perspectives around what it's like to have a diagnosis and then live in a context where the world around you doesn't really support you. And just to give you an example, particularly in education, you know, you will have parents who they have their children, they'll get a call from the principal one morning, and they'll show up at school and the principal is waiting at the gate of the school with their child and saying, you have to take your child. We cannot do anything for your child. We don't know how to work with your child. We don't have the resources here to support you. And so that kind of story is unfortunately not, it's not unusual. So that there is a lot of that. And we're just hoping that with this game that we've created, we can start to see some of that narrative really change. And then the third one is prioritizing fairness and non-discrimination for children. And again, that's been a kind of a central to our design process. So here is me. This is me testing one of the first iterations of the game on the Oculus Rift. It turns out that in that version, I did not get Tunde to greet me. So we went through a few kinks and made some adjustments as a result of that. But yeah, we kind of really learned a lot through that process. So these are just some more details on the policy guidelines as well. So I'll just move through those since we've spoken about those. So next you should see where we are so far.
Okay, so as I mentioned, we've been working on this for quite a while. First started in 2018, and the repo for that first build is on GitHub. So if you're the kind of person that likes to tinker around with stuff, please head on down, look for Missy 3D and have a look at that. The current version that we're working on, still in process, but the goal is like really to try and get this done by the end of the summer. We've done a ton of research, some of which Tokes has spoken about, but we have done some user testing and buddy storming. You might have seen an image that we just flicked through a few slides back. We have obviously either worked with communication partners of children with autism or people living with autism to get their feedback and their thoughts. We've evaluated the previous build. And even more importantly, we've done buddy storming exercises, because it was one thing to conceive a game. It was another thing altogether to have Nigerians play it and go through the motions, some of which you would not expect. You know, it's like them saying to the child, come and get ice cream. And it's like, no, you're not moving. And let's try and incorporate some of what we learned from the guide. So all really useful in helping us to refine and move forward with this. So in terms of next steps, we are actually done with the storyboarding and a lot of like the buddy storming and role playing. We're currently focused on trying to get the NLP working properly. We intend to use Dialogflow, and that's been a bit of an experiment for us. And we've got the 3D design, the environment mostly done. I'm working on the 3D characters and mocap for animation. And as I said, we hope to have this all done by the end of the summer, and hopefully a few of you can check it out then. I know our time is just about up. Is that right? Yeah, okay. But we are going to have a Q&A session happening after this. So if you could please come on over and join us in the Spark Q&A room. We would love to chat with you, share a bit more about what we are doing, and get your feedback as well.
Absolutely.